Over the last 50 years, the United States has fought wars, sought peace, and tackled big issues. In the midst of all those fights, you would have found John Kerry. He's our guest this week on a special edition of Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me, as always, is my friend and co-host, G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. And we do that each week by sitting down with scholars, journalists, and an occasional public official to talk about the stories shaping American life today. We're joined this week by a very special guest. John Kerry is the 68th Secretary of State of the United States. He served 28 years in the United States Senate and 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being with us.
Happy to be with you.
Your new memoir, Every Day is Extra, it's a remarkable read. Congratulations.
Thank you.
This is not the first book that you've written. Talk to us about writing a memoir as opposed to some of the other things you've written.
Well, let me begin, first of all, by expressing and sharing in the euphoria of the Red Sox victory yesterday.
You have your priorities straight.
That's the most important thing. Well, a memoir is obviously it's a test of your memory, but it's also an expression of your own view of your own life, and that's very different from a policy book. And all the books I'd written previously were policy. A book on the new war, which was about what was happening in terms of corruption in other countries and to some degree here, that at the time was beginning to insert itself into international affairs and governance and banking. So we targeted what was happening with the Contras in Latin America and trafficking in drugs to fight a war that was illegal. And we focused on narcotics coming into our country and how it gets there and what the banking structure is that permits that. It was really about accountability in Washington, and much has happened since then. A number of movies have been made. Tom Cruise movie recently. I saw a story of Barry Seal, one of the pilots who was flying the drugs in. Then I wrote a policy book when I ran in '04. Which was really a vision for how we build a stronger and better America. And finally, Teresa and I together wrote a book called This Moment on Earth, which characterized the efforts of individual activists to try to have an impact on our environment and to pull us back from the brink, which now with the UN report that was just put out the other day, people hopefully are coming to understand is even more critical at this moment in time. So those are easier books to do. You sit down, you write the policy, and somebody can edit. This was a lot of from the heart and from the gut. And I've had people interview me who said, you know, John Kerry, I've covered you for 30 years, 35 years. I thought I knew you, but I didn't. I learned all kinds of things I didn't know about you in the course of this book. And that's what it's meant to do. It's honest. And I think the book in and of itself, beginning with the end of World War II and my introduction to this world, is a roadmap for how we come back from the brink today, and that's why I think it's important.
Well, so one of the things that struck me as I was reading it was the effect that November 22nd, 1963 had on you. You described the death of President Kennedy as your impetus to public service. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Well, I think I was already interested in public service, and I was interested in perhaps journalism or the Foreign Service or perhaps electoral politics. But I hadn't, defined any of that. But the one thing that I knew with the loss of President Kennedy, and it was a precursor to other losses. I mean, I lost a lot of friends in Vietnam, some very close ones, one of my closest at college. and one of my closest in the war in Vietnam. So that's just a diversion for a moment. That's where the title "Every Day is Extra" comes from. It's really the notion, and you don't have to go to war to have that sense of a title. You know, you can have a brush with cancer, or you can lose somebody very near and dear to you and not be able to explain why, or you can have a car accident or whatever. But if you get that sense of, whoa, wait a minute, I'm lucky, I'm here on earth, I'm really fortunate, every day you wake up, you have a chance to write the slate. And to me, that's a gift, and that's what I wanted to write about. But I think that President Kennedy was this, I mean, he represented the hopes of our generation at that time. He was exciting, he was young, he was vigorous, he was expressing a sense of possibilities. Not just going to the moon, but a sense of possibilities every day with the Peace Corps and with all the other things. And I think, you know, I kind of resolved, I said, you know, we can't capitulate to that kind of nihilism, to the negative impulse of people, and frankly, to evil. I mean, we all know in life, you know, the struggle of faith is to some degree a struggle between good and evil, not exclusively, but to some degree. And that was a moment of evil, and I think for me, it certainly resolved the notion, you know, you got to go out and combat that. You've got to do something to make the world a better place.
So you, early in the book, I noticed that there are multiple references to World War II and the greatest generation and what those men and women did to save the world. And I wonder, you know, for students today, a lot of whom the Second World War is ancient history, what inspired you about that, particularly as you began thinking about your own service in the military?
That's a great question, Jim, and it brings up a lot of different themes, to be honest with you. I write in the book about how my first memory as a child was holding my mother's hand, walking through the rubble of what had been her home in France, and right after the war. It was 1947. I was 4 years old, and she was crying, and I didn't know why she was crying. It upset me, obviously, four-year-old kid. And I saw a chimney going up into the sky in the rubble, and I saw a staircase, stone staircase going up into the sky, and that was it. That was all that was there. But I remember the sound of the glass crunching under our feet, the broken glass, and I remember walking through this rubble, and the grass had grown yay high. And I knew it was because of war. I mean, my mother told me the story, and I heard it repeatedly, you know, at age 6, age 7. And then I went back to the beaches of Normandy at that young age. I saw the detritus of World War II on the beaches. I mean, it was fresh memory. There came to be a time, you know, after Vietnam, when I came home from Vietnam, how quickly it came, that there were more years between my memory of Vietnam and where I was then in life than there was between World War II and what I saw there. So it was very proximate for me. And I played in German bunkers as a kid. I mean, there was a big bunker right outside the house. My mother was there. My mother's American. My mother was a family from Boston. And her father had moved abroad for business. He was doing business abroad for a number of years. So we kids were used to, you know, being shuttled back and forth a little bit. And my mother didn't come to America until she was about 20-something when the war. She was taking care of refugees in Paris at Montparnasse station when the Germans, the Nazis, were about to come in. She was told, you know, the Nazis are coming in tomorrow, you better get out of Paris. So she got on a bicycle with her sister and foraged her way across France to Portugal, got on a ship and came to America. So war had always been in my consciousness in terms of the terrible impact in Europe. I had an aunt who was interned by the Vichy government for helping Jews to escape identification and potential transfer to a concentration camp. And so it affected our family. My aunt's husband died as a pilot in the war, et cetera. So then, of course, senior year, I mean, our years were fairly tumultuous. I mean, freshman year at college, we almost went to war with the Soviet Union. Sophomore year at college, President Kennedy was assassinated. Junior year, the civil rights movement was in full blossom, and we were sending buses from Yale down to the South to break the back of Jim Crow and engaged in the civil rights effort. And then senior year of Vietnam sort of invaded all of our lives. Do you go? Don't you go? Do you go to grad school? Do you get married? Do you go to Canada? I mean, these choices began to pile up by 1968. By the time I graduated in 66, it wasn't as much of a moral crisis in America, but it was by 1968. And I chronicle that. I sort of chronicle in this book this transformation that took place and how it affected all of us at that point in time. But that's why war had an impact. And then, of course, fighting in a war and seeing what the war did here at home. I have a chapter dedicated, not just, I describe the war, because I think it's important for people to understand so what the input was that affected the choices I made. But I didn't first demonstrate against the war when I came home. The first thing I did was become involved in Earth Day, 1970. And we organized around the notion, the very simple notion that, gee whiz, you don't want to live next to a toxic waste site and get cancer. You don't want to drink water that kills you. You don't want your kids breathing air that sends them to the hospital, which is which we're in the middle of. So we got 20 million Americans to come out of their homes and go demonstrate about what they wanted. And that we translated into a political movement so that those 20 million Americans were activated into the electoral process. And we targeted the 12 worst votes in the United States Congress, labeled them the dirty dozen, and in the next election, 7 of the 12 lost their seats. And guess what happens? When the survivors, the other congressmen, are sitting around and they realize, oh my God, these guys lost because of this, suddenly it's a voting issue. That's what you have to do. Turn your aspirations into voting issues. And we haven't been doing that lately in this country. And it's what my recipe for what we have to do to come back from this is, and that's why I think the book shows the path all the time about how you create accountability. We have to restore that. The current administration was put in place by 54.2% of America's eligible voters deciding it was worth voting for the President of the United States. 54.2%. When I ran in 2004, it was a 60.3% turnout. And when Barack Obama won in 2008, it was a 62.3%. You get the drift? The story of where we are is partly written by who turned out, but it's much more written by who didn't even bother to vote. So shame on us, the way we restore our own democracy in this country and get control over the big money that is polluting the agenda, if not outright stealing it, and the way that we end gerrymandering of districts so Americans can't even have a legitimate national election in the fall where you're voting, because it's all cooked, it's all fixed. That's what Americans are angry about, and they're angry on the right, center, and left equally. And I think people need to just get about the business in the next 27 days of making sure this is a course correction moment.
So you went to the Senate for the first time from the state of Massachusetts in January 1985. What surprised you about, at that point, going from sort of an opposition leader, a leader of a movement of veterans against the war, Earth Day, as you talked about, to being on the inside? What surprised you?
What surprised me was the kind of clubbiness of it all. The seniority system and the ways in which the system kind of tried to pull you to a certain pole, I think, as much as anything. Even as that, in fairness, I want to be careful, even as that was a kind of tempering and quieting kind of way of making sure you were reasoned and not. And that's what the Founding Fathers intended when they created a 6-year term and a body that could stand apart a little bit from the passions of the day. That all began to change in 1994 with the Gingrich Revolution and the Contract of America, where we began to see a different kind of person coming to the Senate. I tell people frequently now, it's not that the rules of the Senate are broken or the rules of Congress are broken completely. although there are some rules that could be refined, but it's the people who changed. And we saw, when I came to the Senate, what I also noticed was the way you get things done is by building relationships. You have to realize that you've got to compartmentalize to some degree. You can't just get mad at somebody because they voted in what you think is a stupid way, and so you don't talk to them ever again, because the next day you may need their vote and they may be prepared to give it to you on another matter. So like diplomacy, where we have to compartmentalize, Putin invades Ukraine and takes Crimea, and we obviously are bitterly opposed to that and remain so, but we still had to work with them to get the Iran nuclear agreement, or to get the Paris agreement, or to try to get the chemical weapons out of Syria. And those things happen because you can compartmentalize and separate. Reagan and Gorbachev compartmentalized. Richard Nixon, when he went to what was then Red China, compartmentalized. Because that's the way you make things happen in the world. And what we see now is a very different kind of foreign policy, sort of all or nothing, my way, the highway. And we're attacking our allies. We're separating ourselves from a critical alliance that since World War II has made a difference. We're actually, regrettably, inadvertently, but through a combination of false premises, and in some cases ignorance, and even falsehoods, we are separating ourselves from the traditional role the United States has played to make the world safer, and it is in fact becoming more dangerous by the day.
So given that we are there in Congress, how do we restore what you were talking about, bipartisan cooperation?
By putting people in there who believe in it and for whom it's a premium.
And that's
if you have a majority leader of the United States Senate who says the entire objective of their party is to make the just elected president of the United States a one-term president, you have a problem. That is a recipe for disaster. That cannot be the objective of any party. And so you need people who are adults who are going to stand up and say, this isn't the way we're going to do business. I believe personally that if the four major leaders of the House and Senate, Speaker, Minority Leader, Democratic Majority Leader, and Minority Leader of the Senate, if they got together and said, you know what, this isn't working for our country, and we need to change it, and here's how we're going to change it. We're going to stop this business of raiding each other's willingness to work together, and stop having a perpetual election and a perpetual political ideological war. We're going to make things work, so we invest in infrastructure, so we fix education, so we have health care that makes sense. I mean, we're spending so much more on health care in the United States and getting worse returns than countless countries around the world. People ought to be incensed by that. But there are ways to fix it without making the system worse. So I think we're in an incredible crisis moment where we really have to fight to make wise choices. And by the way, President Xi and President Putin are not wasting any time. They are very busy going out there with a very specific agenda to write a new narrative for the world. And the narrative they're writing starts with the liberal order of the West is dying, and the United States is in decline. And every day that goes by that we have irresponsible non-decision making or decision making, we are contributing to that narrative.
And that narrative is embraced by a lot of people, and not just abroad, but also in this country.
Correct. Well, it is, but it's a different, I think it's different from that in a sense. I don't think people are specifically addressing that narrative. I think there's an anger that has welled up in a great part of America at the lack of ability to get ahead and to be able to live the dream, to be able to do what, America was always reaching rising expectations. And I don't see the current administration selling an expectation, but they're certainly not empowering people to reach it when it's billionaires, the 1%, that get most of the returns of the last tax cut. That's not going to, it's just not appropriate. I mean, we have 51% of all of America's income today going to 1% of Americans. That's just not a sustainable political equation, folks. Just think about it philosophically, morally, and politically, in every way. If that continues, this anger will continue. And I don't know what it'll produce, right, left, or center. I can't tell you. But right now, people are not making decisions based on facts. If they were, you wouldn't pull out of the Paris Agreement. You wouldn't pull out of the Iran agreement. You just wouldn't. What you're seeing is the sort of all politics every day, all reality show every day. You know.
So let me pick up on this theme a little bit, though. So during the 2016 campaign, candidate Donald Trump used to love his rallies to chant "Lock her up," talking about the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. This past week, in another rally, talking about Dianne Feinstein, they were chanting "Lock her up." Is there something? Well, no. I mean, what is the consequences of essentially threatening to criminalize political opposition?
It's, I mean, it's just dangerous. It's really dangerous. It's unleashing forces that have nothing to do with facts, nothing to do with reason. And when you look historically, and you're an historian, when you look historically at the times in human history when that has happened, it's had very, very grave consequences overall, specifically. I mean, you know, 2 world wars were fought partially out of the fear that came in a country because there was huge anxiety, huge instability. And that instability was fed by a premise of human superiority of one race over another, of finding scapegoats to target, and you had a lot of chance back then. Not just about lock her up, but burn the books and kill those people. And so we had 30 million Russians who died in the war. We had 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust. We had, you know, countless millions of civilians who died in the bombings and the fire bombings and so forth. That could be the outgrowth, because when you have a demagogue who mixes the demagoguery and the instinct for power with economic and political fear, with a specific scapegoating and targeting of a weaker group of people or a race or religion, and we see some of that going on too, that is really dangerous stuff, folks. And we should be very worried about these chants. We should be very worried about a president who sees fit to personally mock and make fun of and attack on very personal terms a United States senator or a reporter who is physically challenged, and you mock that person. That's so unbecoming of the presidency, let alone of any president. And we're just not dealing with facts. It's a real problem, folks, in terms of how you govern. I mean, you know, I found that in the Senate, increasingly, that, you know, you have to build consensus around choices. That's what democracy is. And the choices are, how do we spend taxpayer money? How much taxpayer money do we spend? What makes us stronger? What doesn't? My colleague, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the senator from New York, famously said, everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts. Now we have people talking about alternative facts. There are no alternative facts. There just aren't. 2 and 2 is 4. 4 and 4 is 8. We can predict, we can tell you with certainty when the moon is going to rise in 2 years, absent some catastrophic event that nobody foresees. Mathematics, arithmetic, algebra, these things that we spent centuries creating are being attacked, in a sense, by this lack of ability to know what the baseline of facts are. The Washington Post has chronicled that the president has perhaps lied as many as 5,000 times, or approximately, right, almost at 5,000. I mean, 5 or 10 lies 15 years ago would have been enough to call into question the legitimacy of presidency. So I think, Jim, that the challenge is enormous for us. And I say this without regard to liberal, conservative. I have conservative streaks, I have liberal streaks, I have, you know, it's a matter of common sense that you've got to decide to apply. But I'll tell you what, we're not building things in America. We're not doing what we need to do to remain the great country that we are, let alone make it great again, or whatever the slogan is. I mean, the fact is we have to make America fair again. And we have to make America a place of common sense and facts again. And an example, China is busy spending $1 trillion a year on the One Belt, One Road initiative. They touch on some 70 countries. They built railroads into 7 European countries, 49 routes. And those railroads are now carrying cargo from China to Europe. And it is cheaper to go by rail from China to Europe than it is to fly or go by sea. Go figure. Think about that. They're spending $500 billion on research laboratories and technology labs in each of those countries that they touch. They're building ports in the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, Persian Gulf, Djibouti, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. So we've got to get in the game, and we can't get in the game if Congress can't do anything, if we're not able to even pass a budget or spend money. So restoring our democracy is not, there's only one way to do it, folks. Vote. It's the only way to do it. And people have got to go out and be part of the system and organize and make their reality known.
We got to leave it there. It's a powerful note. Secretary of State John Kerry, thank you so much for being with us. The book is Every Day is Extra. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. He's Wayne, I'm Jim. We hope you'll join us again next week for more Story in the Public Square.